course of today's presentation. It'll be given by Zac Tudor, who joins us. I think at least I'm able to see him here on Zoom. It's a less familiar interface than Teams, but I can certainly see him, and he'll be sharing his screen today discussing a range of topics around urban resilience, biodiversity, placemaking, and the sort of the broader remits of what landscape architecture generally captures. We're absolutely thrilled and delighted that he can join us live from Sheffield. He's working with Arup for the last 5 or so years, and prior to that, spent far more than 2 decades in more of a council setting with Sheffield City Council, in fact, delivering public realm from a council perspective, and has now drawn that experience back into his time spent with Arup across the UK and further afield. So a lot of that experience, Zac, and I think it's fair to say would sort of capture that transition between public and private, and thinking about how public space can not only look great, but also function as part of a sort of a resilient-led approach to urban design. So a lot of that hopes to be presented and, of course, discussed here today. So there is a comment section on the call. We welcome any questions, queries, or comments. And then after maybe a 30-minute presentation, we hope to present some of those questions. If they are reasonable and appropriate enough, we'd love to hear from Zac in response to any questions that people are able to submit over the comment section here. So, Zac, without further ado, I'd love to introduce you formally, Zac Tudor from Arup. And this is me passing the mic to you virtually, so you certainly have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bart, and hi everyone. Hopefully everybody can hear me and everybody can see the screen that I'm presenting. And really, I suppose it's a great opportunity. I'm so passionate about wanting spaces and places to just do and deliver a lot more for both people and nature. And I really, I am passionate, and I'm passionate that I think landscape architects should be at the forefront of this. I don't think we always are, and I think sometimes that's our fault and sometimes that's others' faults. But I'm really passionate. I think we should be owning this area quite a lot more than we are doing at the moment. So it's really just, what I'm going to sort of talk around over the next 30, 40 minutes or so is just a combination of my experience, my past experience, how I think landscape architects can get involved more in these sort of opportunities and really push to get to the table, to change, to influence in a much far greater way than perhaps landscape architects, don't always get that opportunity to do. So I've got an awful lot to say, frankly, so please do bear with me. Some of the slides we'll just pass by just as a nice image to sort of represent what I've been talking about, and some others we'll dwell upon a little bit longer to try to dissect. And if there's anything you do want to pick up, then please do pop it in the chat or keep it to the end, and we can, I think Bart was going to sort of try to collate all those sort of points up, and we can deliver as many of those sort of questions and answers as we can do at the end. So this is what I'm hoping to roughly cover. I'm not going to sort of talk through it all now, but the thing that may drop off the end is perhaps some of the past project examples and things, but I really want to try and get those real key messages across to you guys as much as you can. And they are debate points as well as much as anything else. This is just my view on life as a landscape architect, my experiences, and I think there's lots of other experiences and thoughts that maybe don't align with some of this stuff as well. So please do speak up if you feel alternative messaging and whatever else. So I suppose what is our challenge? Our challenge is a global one. Frankly, it can be in Sheffield, it can be in Leeds, where this was several years ago now. It can be in India, it can be in Peru, it can be in Australia. It's a global challenge that it's not just about water, it's about our changing climate and how these things are changing in unparalleled ways, really, in terms of how we understand the planet, its function, its functionality, and how it influences our lives on a daily basis. And some may see that and think, oh my goodness, that's horrific, and it is. But we're lucky enough to live in a country, in a set of countries that are much more resilient to these impacts, and to sort of we can work around a lot of these impacts that we have. In other parts of the world, it is serious danger to life, to threaten to livelihoods and so on as well. So yes, it's really disturbing, and people do die in these instances. In the next slide I have, which was Sheffield 2007, A really big storm event hit us over several days, and 2 people did die in this instance as well. But again, it's a massive, horrific consequence to all of this stuff. But it's again, when you look at countries that don't have the established infrastructure that we perhaps do, it's tenfold the disaster that these sort of situations and consequences can have. And it really isn't just about water. If you think about the urban environment that we live in, there is so many challenges that we are starting to have to face on a regular basis now. It's not just become, every few years, every year. So, these challenges are becoming a constant for us. And, whether that is an environmental issue, whether it's a personal, physical, mental issue, that these are all things that are affecting us and our environment and our biodiversity on a daily basis now. So it's really just my thoughts around this are there's all these challenges, but can we use landscape? Can we use placemaking? Can we use the resilience that we could add into that as an extra over benefit to start not solving all these problems, but start at least pushing back through adaptation of those design principles to start turning these more beneficially, changing them around a little bit more. And I am definitely not considering that blue and green infrastructure and resilient design is going to solve them all overnight, but it's a big part to sort of start to understand how we can make our environments in a much more attractive and healthy, livable place to be. And I suppose there's loads of terms for all of this stuff, and I hate getting bogged down with terminology and abbreviations to things. But really, I suppose I'm trying to look at this as interjecting, adapting urban places generally through existing places and changing them around and changing and adapting them to give them a regenerative, beneficial approach to this stuff. So it's not just a traditional approach. It's not just sustaining something. It's actually giving back a lot more. And I think, giving back through biodiversity, giving back to communities, through health and well-being, through that adaptation of how we see landscape design, I think does start to open the door to a much more interesting and vibrant, bright future for landscape architecture as a whole. And landscape architects do have that ability to set those visions, to set those goals, and to set that higher standard of thinking, to deliver something which is frankly, I mean, this was a scheme that I delivered. We started on it in 2012, and it was sort of all done and dusted, I suppose, very early 2016. But it was going to be it was a ring road. It was the Greater Green Project in Sheffield. It was a ring road, so there's dual carriageways, there's barriers to movement, barriers to physical sort of constraints to people being able to use the street in any other way other than what was dictated to them. It was all traditional drainage, gullies. It was just full on assault, I suppose, to people and nature. And we had the opportunity to change these things around, and we could have done it in a simple way to just reduce the carriageway width a bit. Lots of nice granite paving either side, tree-lined avenues. But we really felt that, I really felt that we could actually give back an awful lot more to these sort of spaces, these emerging neighbourhoods as well. That we were sort of there was lots of residential neighbourhood emerging from these areas. So rather than just give them lots of wide granite paved spaces, why not give them garden-like environments that were starting to manage and deal with loads of different benefits for them, for people, but also that nature, that benefit, but also for resilience, for climate change, for SUDS water management principles as well. And I think we set that picture, we set that vision for senior leadership, senior management to actually get a feel for what a space could become. And then we filled in the blanks, and this isn't a visualization. This is something that we delivered, and still looks like this nearly 11 years on now as well. Really, it's changed and evolved, but it still has at the heart of it a really green, sinuous movement and fully functioning SUD systems throughout. And that's over 2 kilometres long and is growing an awful lot more in the coming months at the moment, actually, as they deliver new phases of work. So we can do it through this integrated design approach about how we sort of still maintain bus movement, car movements, but you give back an awful lot more to people and give people space to breathe, space to live within it. But having that sort of using planting, using that successional vegetation, using the blue infrastructure principles to actually pull all of that together as like a green vein, green and blue vein that runs through our sort of urban spaces and really transform things in a way that's really not probably been done that much before. And I do love that image, but I also feel quite a lot of regret in that image, in that I'm still, that photograph was probably taken at least 8 years ago, if not more. And I'm still using these images for transformation and what the future can be. This is, Sheffield has been living and breathing this project, but lots of other projects like this now as well for many years. But why aren't we seeing this developing out in all the towns and cities that we have around us? Why isn't this just becoming the norm rather than still seeing it as a great vision for the future? So, apart from the fact that I do think it's a fantastic photograph, it's not one of mine, it's one of Nigel's, because Nigel Dunnett, Professor Nigel Dunnett, but he takes a far better photograph than I do. So I do use a lot of his images as well. And it is truly about changing the perception of space. That's what that street looked like originally. And you actually then start to understand, rather than just thinking, like, let's go and plant it all up and we can do suds and stuff on it. You just need to take a step back sometimes and think, what is nature doing? How does nature manage water? And try to borrow those principles, those functions that are happening in nature to slow, to cleanse, to treat water as it moves through the natural hydrological cycles. Can you sort of borrow some of that stuff to turn it into an urban context? And that's not an easy thing to do, frankly, a lot of times, because there's so many constraints to an urban environment, as we all know. But it is about using that natural function as much as you can do to turn something that was that into that sort of scenario and that function, and that is dealing with an awful lot of the functionality of the images from the natural photographs we were just looking at, really slowing that flow down, managing sediment loads, treating water biologically through its, the healthy aerated soil systems, slowing that water flow so it's sort of infiltrating away, it's evapotranspirating away, but it's, if needs be, sort of moving still through those hydrological cycles, but probably recharging groundwater to a large degree, but if needs be, can flow through to the watercourses, or if needs be, again, eventually, if there's no watercourse, then it goes through to combined sewer systems, if absolutely needed, as an overflow point of exceedance. But generally, it's managing and keeping and holding on to water and frankly celebrating it as much as you can do in the landscape, rather than something that we need to get down a big gully grate as quickly as possible and say goodbye to it, because that only leads to more and more negative consequences further down the line. And for me, it is about traditional approaches being very one-dimensional. And when I say traditional approaches, it's traditional grey engineered road schemes, but equally traditional public realm schemes as well. Really, they are so one-dimensional in their offer. They can be great public spaces to be within, but why can't we add those, the second, the third dimensions into these things to sort of really truly get lots more out of the money that we're putting into them in the first place? And that really, I think, is the answer to all of this, is an integrated approach to delivering these things, using lots of different disciplines to come together. And again, where landscape architecture, I think, has that vision and that ability to manage and balance other people's viewpoints in a much more equalized way. So, taking on board all of these things. And the one thing missing from here that I forgot to slip in was the fact that highway engineering is a really key part of all of this as well. And all of the schemes that I've done in Sheffield were truly landscape led. So they were sketched out by myself or others in terms of sort of delivering what we think is the right approach. And then the highway engineers come in and do all their technical elements of due diligence to actually achieve what we were wanting to achieve in the first place. But it's having that ownership of the vision, I think, up front, and and balancing everybody else's viewpoints, that actually truly gets us to a place where we get a great place to be within for all of us. And I mean, in Arup's world, we call this total design, I guess, really. but a total streets approach to all of this stuff that I would sort of integrate and think around is integrating SUD solutions within, within a general public realm design space. You think about the design space, but at the same time, not as an afterthought, you are thinking about how water management can integrate into all these solutions, how urban greening can integrate into all these solutions, how active travel continuously move through all these spaces, and how these places and spaces can create dwell points and that social inclusiveness that really does bring people together and to sort of give them the opportunity to recharge their batteries as they move through or just dwell within these places a little bit longer. And these can be, these are a little bit more, some of these are a little bit more suburban in character, but these are bioswales that are running around people's housing and neighborhoods now, where we did a big project in Mansfield, which was a total town approach to delivering flood resilience for a whole town using only nature-based solutions, which has been a great success story for the town, but also just for understanding of how we can manage these things in a really scalable way. Using research-based urban greening rather than just sort of hoping for the best approach to stuff. And again, thinking different scales of thinking about how climate change will react to some of these things as well. So native vegetation solely, we have found to be really unsuccessful, but integrating native and non-native species, garden environment species effectively into these systems that are ecologically fitting the environment are really, really important to achieve both that visual aspect to it, but also that biodiversity benefit as well. And again, that active travel bit, which integrating people on bikes into spaces rather than just tagging them onto a red or a green strip along a roadside or next to a roadside, actually integrating people into these environments is, again, I use this as a daily basis to get to work, and every time I use it, I still can't help but smile as I'm moving through the spaces. It's just such an uplifting space to cycle through. It's safe. It's just, and granted, you can't achieve these on every project because space is limited in urban centres, and you have to balance out other other sort of disciplines and elements and things as well. But when you can achieve these things, it's such an uplifting thing to be within as a human being. And that sort of benefits, that recharging the batteries, being able to immerse yourself in nature-like environments in urban situations, I think is such a valuable element to all of this as well, really. So it's bringing this whole thing together. If you look back at those challenges we looked at initially, these things are starting to be managed and dealt with using blue and green principles through public realm design. And these points, I'm not going to dwell on them, but these are the benefits that you can get from all of this stuff, whether they're environmental, and that can be flood management, water quality benefits, thinking about really drought tolerant maintenance species that never have to get watered. All the planting schemes I'm showing you never get irrigated after the first 1 or perhaps 2 years, depending on when they were planted. After establishment, they are never watered again, really. So it's just thinking about these environmental benefits you can get from it. That carbon capture bit, which is really underestimated at the moment, certainly in that sort of the healthy urban soil side of things, thinking about how carbon can actually get locked down in a really positive way in the soil, the soil conditions and stuff as well. And we'll talk a bit more about soils later on generally. But the benefits for people as well. So we talked about some of those already, but just thinking about environmental, the people side of it, and then that sort of the economic benefits and things as well of just trying to uplift space as much as you can do. So those real factors of, they are really positive for us, they're positive for nature, they're positive for the environment, but you can get these economic benefits as well. And particularly if you start thinking about low maintenance approaches. Again, I'll touch on that stuff again a little bit later on, but really, that low maintenance approach is a really big winner for people, because a lot of the pushback you get in trying to achieve a lot of these things is we'd love to do it, but we could never afford to manage and maintain these things going forward. So if you can start to sort of push back on some of that stuff, that's a real benefit as well, I think. I could talk an awful lot about this slide really, but it means so many different things to so many different disciplines and people, this stuff really. But sustainable urban drainage, the SUDS manual from Syria sort of sets out the four pillars being water quality, water quantity, water quality, amenity value, and biodiversity. And I think, I've sort of shown them there in the size of font. And I think most of the time people would flick to the quantity page and how you're dealing with volumes of water. Then they may touch on to the quality of water. And they're really straining it if they move into amenity. And the guidebook for biodiversity is probably hardly ever thumbed through. It's such a low input opportunity at the moment. And that's the perception of SUDS at the moment. I think it's sort of started quite significantly, probably 30 plus years ago now, with real, certain individuals that were very landscape focused. And I'm not bashing engineers in one slightest bit here, but they have grasped SUDS hugely and now have completely taken it over, frankly, in a lot of these things. Um, and that has meant that the quantity bit of it has sort of really just become the real key element to this stuff, and quality is starting to develop further as people are sort of looking at river quality of water and sea quality stuff and things and everything else. It's starting to get a bit more momentum, but it's so far down the line compared to just dealing with volume and quantity. And that's because from an engineering perspective, that is their key driver to manage, and SUDS is a great way of doing that. But it then leads you to delivering SUD solutions, which are more engineered and modeled solutions rather than real world, if you like, want to call it real world, of actually understanding the landscape and so on, to sort of make sure that you are achieving these things for a wider benefit based thing. If you just look at quantity, if you just look at quality, you're never going to get those wider benefits really. So, all of that said, I think that the blue bits there as well, and every solution to SUDS is different in all these different things. Whether I do an awful lot of retrofit, which is sort of dealing with what we already have in our urban environments and how can we change and adapt that. But there is obviously, a huge growth of new build opportunities at the moment. In the UK, particularly, I suppose at the moment there's a massive house building, alleged massive house building program that's just going to take off the ground, and so new build will become an incredibly important part of SUDS development. Okay. But whether that's urban or that's rural, there's all these different sort of angles to deal with all this stuff. And really, the SUDS manual doesn't really, it's not catching up with all of this. And a lot of people that I talk to would call SUDS really the Wild West at the moment, in that there's no real set principles. I am part of a group of people that we've been commissioned to sort of look at the SUDS manual and start to rethink it slightly in a very different way, to update where we are today, given climate change and everything else. So we are looking at reinvigorating, rethinking the manual quite significantly, but that still doesn't mean that it will set out principles to actually work towards. It still will be this sort of just a guidebook of kit of parts almost that you can still take from or not, as the case may be. And this bit really, I just wanted to add into it, this sort of work stream opportunities where I tend to try to work with landscape architects in Arup. We try to, again, try to push back and own a lot more of this sort of stuff around SUDS and public spaces and infrastructure projects. So it's just sort of really just setting out a few key areas where we're doing this really, and looking at master planning and visioning work, really getting in early now, looking at those wider opportunities to deliver a more resilient master plan. That's a really key growth part of how I see landscape architects being able to get in early stages to work with people like that. Obviously, the bits we've already been talking about around resilient-led placemaking, public realm design, just looking at how to integrate blue and green infrastructure strategies in a more thought-provoking way, rather than just identifying where blue and green influences are. It's actually understanding how they can benefit a new development. How can you build and enhance on those development opportunities? That's, again, just really linking that back to landscape-led approaches to all of this stuff. Looking at we've done quite a lot of pilot projects with like test beds, if you like. Just highway intervention work generally, working on linear routes, junction arrangements, trying to sort of just interject wherever we can elements of that sort of stuff. using our green urban spaces, our park spaces, to sort of look at slightly larger detention basin opportunities where we can gather, hold on to water, and then let it release through at a later date, slowing that flow, if you like. But also really trying to innovate through new details, new ideas. Again, using nature, understanding nature, the functions of nature, and bringing those concepts into it with aggregate sizes. Aggregate for me is a huge part of how we deliver SUDs. It's not everybody's way. It's that Wild West thing where everybody has a different approach to delivering this stuff at the moment. Some more beneficial, some for certain aspects, some others not. But really using that nature angle to sort of support our arguments of why we're at the table there in terms of design processes. But working with engineers to sort of try to make modeling and those digital tools a bit more real world rather than just looking at them completely digitally. Trying to understand that actually, yes, digital modeling can be really beneficial, but it still needs that human eye to understand what's happening in those environments. And the research monitoring bits and things and stuff is linking back to innovation, I guess, really in that cycle of understanding and then reinvention of those ideas. Developer support, we work with developers to try to get them to understand better how we can influence this stuff, and that magic goal of maintenance and adoption of these things, really, and being that critical friend for technical delivery, myth busting a lot of the time. That seems to be part of my job, quite a large part of my job, really, is trying to myth bust away why you can't deliver these things. And so really this brings us through to the part, I suppose. I mean, if we're zooming in on the SUDS aspects to some of this stuff, using green and blue infrastructure. Sorry. In principle, I have, I suppose it's 5 elements of SUDS. It's the storage layer, it's the cleansing and treatment and filtration of that layer, it's the growing medium layer, it's the mulch layer, which is incredibly important to me as well, and then it's the surface layer of the planting aspects and stuff to all of that. There's so many different ways, as I say, to deliver this stuff, but in the main, I try to achieve this stuff because it gives you the greatest opportunity to deal with the most amount of water. If you're going to dig a hole in the ground, if it's in an urban situation, you have immediate high cost involvement to do all the management of it, the actual work itself. It's working around all the ground utilities and all the other ground obstacles that you may have in those environments. It's a high cost activity to dig a hole in an urban situation. And so, why don't we try and absolutely maximize that to the most, if you are going to be going to all that cost to get the most benefit back for in this aspect for water management in principle. So we try to maximize that. So storage volume is really key to all this as well. But really, a lot of that sort of the growing medium is where the engine room of all of this is. That sort of the layer between the mulch and the filter layers. And again, that is 70% aggregate and sand. It's a really high aggregate content. I'll explain why in a little bit more detail in a minute or two. But in principle, that's the engine room for me. That's where it's still allowing storage. It's still creating a growing environment for certain species, but it's also acting as a maintenance tool to reduce the dominance of some weed species that you probably don't want to be in the systems as well. So really just, I'm not going to dwell on this one because I think some of the other slides are slightly more important for today, but it is a really important part of this. It's about thinking about resources. Obviously wasn't that important. It's automatically slipped on. It is about that dwindling resource, aspect to these things as well, really. So it's thinking about soils in a very different way. So it's using recycled waste materials as much as we can do to deliver that stuff. I talk about the aggregates. That waste aggregate opportunity can be very different in different parts of the country or wherever you are in the world even. So it's just researching those aspects to all of that as well, using small plant sizes so that they've not spent lots of resource and management of growing year on year. Using those strategies that have no water approaches and reduce maintenance aspects to all of this stuff, and trying to keep that knowledge, the materials, the wealth, the financial sort of circulation as close as you can to a circular economy, to that region or locality, as you can do, really. I think that those real key aspects to me, it's about, if we're going to be doing this work, why not let's sort of try and benefit that region, that the work that's been done in. And for the manufactured soils, we are, in effect, it's 70% aggregate. It's 20% of it is a green waste compost, and then there's 10% which is a natural growing medium. But we tend to use sugar beet washing. So when sugar beet goes to the factory, it's washed, and some of the main supplier in the UK of sugar beet of sugar, British Sugar, sells a soil product based on the reclaimed soil from the sugar beet washings, and we tend to use that, which has a silty, sandy loam content to it, just to give it a bit of something to kickstart and sustain some of the wider life, the flora and fauna of the growing medium. But in effect, it's a huge amount of aggregate that we're putting in there, and that creates a very low fertility, a very free draining environment. So that's incredibly stressful to most plant species, particularly a lot of the weed species that we probably don't want to be over dominant in these environments. So it reduces that dominance quite significantly. But then that means you have to get the plant species that will not just survive, but potentially thrive in these environments as well. So it's matching up plants to the soil type to deliver the lower maintenance strategy, which again has been a lot of research over the years to sort of look at these ways of working in this way. And that's about that research-based ecological thinking, really. The plant species, the plant mixes and strategies we tend to use are dynamic. So within a given area, we can have 6 to 10 plants per meter square. They generally are 9 centimeter pots, so quite small size pots. They can go up to 2 litre pots for some species that need a little bit more support and help to get going. But in that sort of that meter square area, you would have a percentage of pioneer species that are going to get going really quickly, get established really quickly. And I say quickly, like within 12 months. So they are starting to look good. So that gives you an immediate wow, if you like. It gets you buy-in from the communities that actually something is working and doing okay. Those things tend to then drop away over 3 to 5 years. They'll sort of slowly disappear from from the planting mixes. And then the middle ground species and those longer term stress tolerant real survivors and start to take over, that are longer term, slower to establish species. And again, the middle ground will then start to diminish a bit, and it'll be the longer term survivor stuff. But it hugely depends on the type of planting you're going for, whether it's a bit more denser planting. The middle ground species will tend to drop away quicker. But if you go for a more skeletal, more sort of stressed environment in different mixes that you establish, and those middle ground species can be those long-term survivors equally. And I don't need to explain the rest of those things, but making sure that stuff is structurally diverse as well, because that gives you the biggest benefit to shade and to the diversity of opportunity for biodiversity if you get that sort of vertical structure established as part of this as well. I've just sort of covered off, I suppose, some of this stuff, but in reality, an urban suds habitat, or the ones that at least I design, are, they're generally hot environments. They are dry, they are low fertility, they are quite heavily polluted. They get occasionally inundated with water. They are subject to people doing things that you really don't necessarily want them to do in the planting. And they have that generally that low input of maintenance and lack of maintenance knowledge. So, it's quite a difficult task to get things to establish. Every scheme you do isn't going to have the highest level of maintenance output, the highest ability for people to be on site during, every week of every month of every year. So it's just thinking about how can we make these things more ecologically niche fitting, so you can reduce that maintenance burden and make them more cost effective, thus then reducing the opportunity of people saying we'd love to do it but we can't afford it. So it's at least starting to sort of drive that question and, well, drive the answer to those questions, really. I mean, the Greater Green scheme that we did originally has, I mean, it has 2 or 3 visits in late spring, early summer for weeding maintenance, because the canopy hasn't closed up. Once the canopy's closed over, then it's just, we don't bother weeding. And really, the only the other maintenance task, the only real maintenance task after that, is to just go back in January, February time and cut most things back to round about 150 mil high, and take it all off site, clean everything through, remove any rubbish that's sort of found its way into there that you couldn't see because it's all, the canopy's closed down. Take out any rogue weed elements, like buddleia is a real problem weed because it thrives on neglect, it thrives on low fertility, so it probably is number one enemy to most of my stud schemes. But you know, it's just giving that clearance back and tidying it all through so that, you know, the rest, the back end of the winter period can then sort of, it just looks neat and tidy. And then by late March time, you've got all the spring bulbs, spring flowers starting to get going. And it's that cycle of life is starting to kickstart again and get going. I always a bit reticent about putting plant names and stuff into lists and things, but there's just a few species there that I do find as good doers. I mean, we change our species compositions around quite a lot depending on the situation that we are dealing with, but also it's, you know, it's about the locality, the region. I mean, we're working in India at the moment, we're working in Peru, so obviously those species compositions change hugely. But it is, you know, even regionally within the UK, we are changing our plant compositions quite a lot. We're doing a scheme, quite a large scheme at the moment in the Hastings area in the south coast of England, and that composition of plants is incredibly different to what we'd be proposing up here and in here. And again, we're changing things in Scotland as well. So it's just making sure that, you know, we aren't just relying on a list of species and then it all fails. And you said, well, you said these things are incredibly successful. They are in certain environments and certain situations, but they aren't always. But these species tend to be really quite good doers within these sort of those sort of dynamic planting mixes. And there's just a couple of slides here of just, I suppose, some sort of stuff which, and we are erring, or I'm erring at the moment, more to making things a bit more wild. So they are, you know, it's a definite taste thing, and you know, it's not always appreciated fully. You know, some people still prefer a formal looking planting bed, but you know, these dynamic mixes of planting, native, non-native, do deliver quite an interesting diverse landscape in a situation in an urban centre. But it's not, as I say, it's not for everyone to start with. And I think there is that learning curve. And I think Sheffield definitely went through that learning curve of things, people saying they look messy, untidy. There was then a sort of a thing about actually how they are much more beneficial for the environment, for invertebrates, for pollinators. And people have really got on board with it now and are really starting to understand why we're doing it. There's lots of sort of images that there's lots of information boards, really small scale ones though, in the planting areas that you move through, and people can window shop and understand why these things have been done. So, you know, why the benefits for this, that, and the other, because otherwise, I think people just see these things as just being still that one-dimensional element of it looks really nice. But if they can start to understand the places where they are living and working and playing, they can then start to understand things in a much more holistic way and sort of realize why you perhaps, you know, the things are starting to look a bit messy in December, January time, but it is beneficial that they don't get cut straight away. So, you know, that's been a real positive, I think, and it's about a learning thing from my point of view. I'm probably going to wrap things up pretty soon now, but there's an awful lot of stuff which I sort of I've talked about all leads back to maintenance, and it is about that sort of the design principles that you start thinking about initially. That full cycle of thinking goes right through to, so you design something which actually has a maintenance beneficial input to it at the end of it, and that really is a really big part of how we look about sustainability and ecological thinking around blue and green infrastructure, that you design stuff that will help long term The Greater Green project has now been going for over 10 years, and the planting has had 10 cuts and 10 maintenance visits in that 10-year period. It's still looking amazingly good. I think after 10 years, I'd always envisaged that we'd go back and revisit some of that stuff and rethink some of the things that may have become slightly overly dominant, and just reshuffle, not rethink everything, but reshuffle and reorder some of the things, and perhaps put back a little bit of color diversity into certain aspects to it as well. So that's something to think about over that longer term period, that you probably still want to think, it's not sustainability in terms of, permanence. You do want to have some sort of interjection of thought, of design, as you go through these things, really. So I'm going to end there. But just to say that I think that image there has Plantago lanceolata in the foreground, which I think looks absolutely spectacular in that view. But it's actually, it's obviously a weed, and it would be classed as a weed and removed from planting. But actually, it looks fantastic. It looks like little mini rockets going off. And it's a great thing for biodiversity. And, why wouldn't you want to leave that in place? And there's patches of nettle in amongst all this stuff as well, which again, it's not causing any problems. It's not taking over because there's such a low element of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soils that it can't really compete competitively. But again, having nettle in amongst that environment is a great biodiversity indicator and benefiter as well. So, we probably need to think a little bit less hard about how we maintain and weed these things, and have a more thought-provoking, more probably evidence-based approach to maintenance. When things look good, why should we look about removing them and things, really, if they are providing benefits for wider elements like biodiversity and stuff. So thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Zach. I think that's a pretty remarkable overview of, I suppose, personal opinion, but a pretty remarkable body of work as well. So thank you so much. Conscious that it is well over a decade in the making as well, not least the actual strategic thinking behind it, but then also the delivery, as well as the continued sort of existence, maintenance, as you've mentioned so many times. And it is becoming far more of a significant talking point when it comes to delivery of landscape architectural schemes, far more now than ever before, it would appear. There's a lot of interest in some of the comments and queries, Zach, that relate to that sort of decade-long existence of the scheme. It was delivered somewhere between 8 and 10 years ago, say. Was there any baseline information, or at least baseline data? There was one query from Mark in the comment section. Was there any data gathered prior to the scheme's delivery or existence in the town centre, which offers a bit more of a kind of a numerical or data-based baseline around the success of the scheme? I'm conscious that there was an amazing photo at the beginning of the, well, maybe amazing is the wrong word to use, but quite a significant flood event. And is there any data that backs up the importance of this type of work on the ground? I think you're on mute there, Zach. Sorry.
All right, sorry. It depends, I suppose, which angle you're looking at. If it's ecological, plant-based data stuff, we did. I worked a lot with the University of Sheffield. We did. I mean, my garden was full of test beds about growing things in pure gravel, and then 50% gravel, 70%. So we did loads of. I did loads of stuff, but the University of Sheffield, and particularly Nigel done it. But also Green Business in Sheffield as well had a really big resource of understanding about this stuff. And it was a risk. And I took that risk on in terms of delivering these things from a vegetative point of view. But it was an educated risk in that, I was quite certain that certain species were going to do well and survive and work through. If it was data around water management and water principles, then surface water. This was an area of surface water flooding, of exceedance of water, not from. The images we saw at the start were river water, so that's fluvial flooding. But there's huge areas of most cities have pluvial flooding, which is surface water that can't get into drains and then sort of starts to flow down roads and then gets more and more and more, and it's just obviously all heading to the bottom of somewhere or other. And these were corridors that were exceedance routes that were sort of coming from further up in the, if anybody knows Sheffield, it's an incredibly hilly city. This is at the bottom of the city centre, the top of the city centre. Everything was heading to these sort of locations, and then flows into the river as the final exceedance route. But it was part of a way of heading that off. And this is a great example of where it's a good example of using SUDS for its immediacy. But really, we should be thinking about SUDS in every street, in every part, even at the top of the hills. It's all about holding water where it lands as much as you can. That's much more efficient, and it's much more beneficial and cheaper to deliver it in that way than it is to sort of try to manage it all at the bottom of the hill. That's when you get big, deep craters, bomb craters, with pipes that go into them. They are unusable landscape spaces, really. So yeah, if you can spread out the love of SUDS throughout the whole catchment, that's a much more beneficial way of dealing with it.
Yeah, it's a wider network consideration rather than just one localized or
Yeah,
a smaller
absolutely. Yeah,
localized
yeah,
system. Yeah, for sure. And perhaps that speaks to maybe it's a common enough challenge within landscape architecture across the island of Ireland is almost that initial sales pitch that goes behind so many successful sud schemes is, almost convincing the wider network of other disciplines, Zach. And there's a couple of comments in the query section there around how best, perhaps almost generationally, this can be demonstrated as a massively advantageous approach to urban design to convince perhaps engineers, indeed architects, and the wider design field to take up this sort of approach because it does seem to be a key hurdle almost in the thinking of other disciplines. Perhaps from your wide experience across public and private practice, what are your experiences of almost that sales pitch of a scheme such as this?
yeah. I mean, well, I suppose I mentioned myth busting before. There's a load of preconceived reasons why we'd love to do this, but we couldn't do it because, and there's a massive list of reasons why you can't do it. But frankly, there's one massive reason why we should be doing it, and that is because of that challenge that we all face globally. And if we don't grasp that now, then it's only going to get more expensive and harder to deliver as we move forward. So from that perspective, it is a huge thing. But I think it's sometimes I angle it. For different audiences, I'd angle it different ways, I suppose. Sometimes it's a financial thing. Sometimes it's a wider benefits thing. Sometimes it's just a motive. When I first did Greater Green, I just used one image that I nicked off the internet, in fact, actually, which was a small child running through I think it was a North American prairie, actually, with a little house on the prairie scene, basically, which was one of my favorite programs as a kid. But it was just, I took that image of this child running through the landscape, and I just held that up to all the politicians when we were trying to get the scheme off the ground, and said, wouldn't it be fantastic if the kids of Sheffield could feel like they're running through meadows and environments as they walk to school, walk home from school, walk to the shops. Just in every street and every space in Sheffield, wouldn't it be fantastic if the kids could feel this environment? And that's partly why a lot of the schemes I've delivered have the green elements on either side of the street spaces as well. So it's not just on one side where you can have it. You can have that immersiveness of moving through a meadow-like environment. So it's you have to position it differently. Educated guess again, I suppose, but what somebody's going to come up with as their reasons why they'd love to do it, but they can't do it. And so, it is sometimes it's a motive, sometimes it is that sort of challenge of ecological disaster. Sometimes it's about cost and actually, really drill down those cost elements and benefits. If you're going to be doing a scheme, public realm scheme anyway, it's probably multi-million pound worth of expenditure. Why not really think a little bit harder to sort of immerse this stuff into your design principles and then work through that maintenance sort of stuff and really talk, because I do have, when we start a new scheme, we tend to, within the first month or so, get to have a session with the maintenance gangs, the maintenance team, the people that are responsible for maintenance, and actually just talk to them about what we want to propose, because that starts to allay their fears to, providing all this stuff. Because otherwise, that's just a niggle in the ear of other people that are sort of, we're wanting to push more green, we're wanting to push more blue, but they've got lots of niggling in their ears from other departments going, where's all the money going to come from to maintain this, and so on and so on. So yeah, it's a different ask for lots of different people, really.
Certainly. Yeah, conscious that we're going to be wrapping up in the next minute or two. But Zach, just again, it does come back to something which is so important, is perhaps not just convincing other design disciplines that this is a feasible and indeed massively beneficial approach to urban design and wider streetscape development, but also that continued conversation with those who are in an Irish context called taking in charge, and this idea that the council may demonstrate a historic or traditional reluctance around what they can actually manage with a capital M. And was there any conversation or oversight between the council and maybe some of the wider design team in delivering this when it came to conversations around management and maintenance? Because obviously you mentioned that it is relatively low maintenance scheme. Was that a sort of a point of apprehension or uncertainty or insecurity from the council from the outset?
Not so much from a resource perspective in terms of the people to do the work. I mean, they actually use a specialist green waste company in Sheffield to do this work, actually, that are absolutely fantastic in that way. I think the cost side of it was, it even surprised me in terms of how much the cost of the maintenance was going to be. When you look back at that grey, the 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 pre-slide of grey to green, where it was just that grey, traditional grey infrastructure, and then you layer into it all of the stuff we ended up doing. The cost analysis came back because we have our Amy, who are our sort of maintenance partner with the city council. They knew exactly how much it cost to maintain the grey scheme. We gave them our new scheme. They then costed all of that, and then came back with the cost to maintain all of the green and blue and everything else. And it was actually cheaper to maintain our new scheme, and the council actually got money back on their maintenance program over. It's a 25-year program of work, and they got money back year on year because of the reduced amount of maintenance risk on that scheme. And it
Wow.
seems completely counterintuitive, but because we rethought the whole scheme and removed lots of heavy cost items, like a central reserve barrier, for instance, has to have really regular annual safety maintenance and stuff done to it. You take that away, you take all the gullies away, you take quite a lot of traffic lights away from the scheme and things. All of these things have huge sums of money attached to them from a maintenance perspective. And you turn all that grey stuff into a positive green stuff, which does obviously have a cost attached to it. But the value was, it was less, and that was such a mind bender. Really, even for me, I didn't think we'd be coming in under the budget of what was the existing grey infrastructure management. So
Yeah.
that was a real win for us, really.
It's a massive win. Yeah. It comes down to sort of the more commercial or capitalist oversight of a scheme to ensure that these things are feasible in the long run. So those sorts of studies, I mean, are there findings of those studies, Zach, that are available online to
They're
demonstrate?
not. I mean,
No.
that high level stuff, I'm happy to sort of share with anybody. But in terms of the commercial realities to stuff, it's confidential in terms of the actual numbers.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the council got money back from it wasn't a small amount either. So they
Mm.
did get money back from that project to reinvest in other sort of ways of maintaining other streets and spaces, really.
Certainly. Yeah, that's brilliant. There are a number of other comments and queries coming through here, Zach, and apologies all that unfortunately we simply have not got the time. Uh, we're 2 minutes to 2 o'clock here, so I'd like to extend a very grateful thanks to Zach and to everyone else for attending today. Zach, you've really presented something which is not only beautiful and functional, but perhaps also quite inspiring for so many in the room. There's a number of comments suggesting that it's not just landscape architects here today, and one of the key remits of the ILI going into 2026 and far beyond is that these sorts of conversations become far more multidisciplinary. So I'd like to thank all 120 who were able to attend today. It's a massive number, so thank you all. And Zach, thank you once again. You can be found online, obviously, through pretty normal channels, I think, through your LinkedIn and Instagram feeds. So if anyone else has any curiosity to maintain this sort of research into Zach's work, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think the recording is going to stop shortly, 1 minute to two. So thank you again, all, and thank you, Zach. And we'll see everybody next month for another CPD session.
Cheers. Thanks all.